Hi Corey, I just recorded this once and my OBS decided not to pick it up, so this one might be a bit shorter and I'm fucking mad basically, but here we go. So I wanted to do a video basically quickly describing kind of what Spring Boot is, how we can use it, and the absolute basics of it so we can get started. So Spring Boot is a server. It's like, so the Spring framework is this huge Java enterprise framework that allows you to build web applications easily. I mean, there's also other uses for it, but that's largely what it's used for. And Spring Boot is a version of this where most things are configured for us automatically, and we don't have to sort of spend forever configuring everything, because that's complicated and takes forever. So there is a template Spring engine, which I think Spring thing, which I've been using for a while. So inside this Git repository, we just go to initial, and if you take this whole initial folder, this is basically a ready to go Git project. It has an application and it has a controller. So a controller is basically just a means of communicating with HTTP. So I don't know how familiar you are with HTTP, but basically it's a way to communicate over the web. There's various different methods like get, post, delete, put. We'll only be using get and post here. I'll link this with some more documents about HTTP to read about it, but very quickly, it's basically just this standard of communicating over the web, and we're going to set up a HTTP server in Java. So basically we receive our requests in HTTP. So this is what a controller can look like. We map it with these annotations in Spring, and this basically means that we will it will be picked up by Spring and deployed. So there's lots of Spring magic of specific things we just need to do, and we can get into the explanations later. I don't think it's worth doing from the very start. So for now, it's just like this is being registered as a bean, and then the Spring application will pick this up and put it into its server, into its deployed server. Yeah. So, and then in this controller, we can basically specify our base path with this request mapping. So we're saying that every request that goes here, so a HTTP request might look like this, like we will send them often in JavaScript, but right now I would just use a framework called Postman. It's like a very popular HTTP framework. I'm more used to using Insomnia. It's something different. It's not as popular. I recommend Postman. And basically we can specify how we send our requests. So this is like the path of one of our requests, right? So we would have HTTP. This is essential, and then we have our local host referring to our local machine. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And then 8080, which is the default port that Spring runs on. You can change that. I don't recommend it. And then from this point, we would then have the stuff specified by our controllers. So in this controller, we have search and list, for example. So it might look like this. Search, list. So when I would run this request, it won't work because the server's not running, but when I would usually run this request, I would basically be calling this bit of Java code, and it would then run this, and in my example it fetches it from a database, and then it passes this. You see that it's expecting to receive a list of search requests. It then passes this into a format you might be familiar with called JSON. JSON is basically a format for passing data around. It's like JavaScript's like default file format. Then you can also do this in XML or loads of other ways, but JSON is by far the most popular one nowadays. And this might be patronizing, but maybe you do, maybe you don't know. Maybe you've heard of JSON, or maybe you're familiar with the format, but you don't know exactly what its name is. So JSON kind of looks like this. So field value, field name, and then its value, right? That's an example JSON object. And then you can have an array of these objects, and blah blah blah. It's not super important because we're not processing them now, but Spring will convert to this JSON automatically for you if you set things up correctly, which in Spring Boot is configured to do that. So and it's sending this response entity, which is a HTTP standard. Again, it's like a standard of, you know, these codes we see when we're accessing the web, like 404 and 200, whatever. So if we look into this HTTP status, we actually see that there's all of these different HTTP statuses. Again, maybe you know this already and you're familiar, but I'm going over it just in case. And each of them corresponds to a message. So 200 corresponds to this. It's 200. In all circumstances where things work successfully, we basically expect to see a 200. There are other methods, but basically between 200 and 300 is successful. That's a request happening successfully, and between 400 and 500 is a bad request. So like the user sends an incorrect request, and then between 500 and, well, just 500 plus is there's an error in the server. So for right now, that's kind of all we need to go over, and I recommend that you kind of go and look through these to, like, the more specific the better usually, especially with errors. So we can use this, basically this response entity class in Spring to communicate this information and to say, okay, we want to return this, we also want to make sure that there's this OK status and things are being properly, you know, there's the proper HTTP standards being followed, and it's easy to use API. Okay, so this is a get mapping. As I've mentioned, there's get and post and all these things, but get is usually when we want to retrieve information from a server. So right now, I'm saying that there's a get mapping on search/list. So again, there should be get, and then it will fetch that point in the Spring server, basically. And most of our processing should happen at the service level. The controller should just be used basically to deal with the request, handle the request and return, and then it passes it through to the service layer in which most of the processing is done. This one is quite empty, but usually we, you know, maybe see a few lines here, blah 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 blah, right? Where you kind of do all the logic, and the services are basically for the business logic layer. Cool. And we specify these things with, you know, as I mentioned, with REST controller for here and with service there. So we want to make sure we follow these things, because if we follow everything like these annotations like service, we can then use something called auto wiring, which is basically a fancy magic way where Spring will create instances of everything for us and we don't need to handle them. So we can create this auto wired constructor in which the value of our search service will be passed in by Spring through something called beans. We can go into this more later. I don't think it's a good idea personally to explain Spring from the ground up. It's better to have a play around with it and use it a little bit to get an idea of what's going on. Okay, one more thing. We also want to be able to parse data sometimes. So sometimes we just want to be able to call this, you know, just call the list, but sometimes we might want to say, you know, we want to get something specific, or we want to, you know, post some data from, or, you know, on our instance, we might be able to post the answer to a question, right? So what we have here is there's one simple way of doing this, which I think this is the only way I'll mention for now, is called path variables. And basically what this means is, you see I have this result/ID here. So the request might look like this. It's a get request to my local host, search result, and then where in place of this ID, I don't write ID like this, I actually put in a value. So let's say I want to put in 500. Let's blah blah blah, right? And then this ID value will be read in here, because I'm mapping it. I'm saying, using these curly braces to indicate it's a path variable, and then I'm saying here, okay, ID is a path variable, and I'm assigning it to this parameter value of ID, and then I can use along here to using my code basically. So it's just like passing a parameter to a normal method, but instead we're passing it through HTTP. And so that's necessary because what I want you to do in your task is basically create a basic Spring Boot server from that template we mentioned, which has these sort of endpoints for now, like post, quiz, answer. So I want the user to be able to submit an answer, Their answer should be based on this question. I don't really mind. I'm trying to leave up the flexibility. I know, like, they're coming up with the actual game and how everything works is fun. I want to use it, have control over that basically. But these are just some outlines. We can always change this. It's just basically getting Spring set up and some ideas of how it could work. So these are the 3 endpoints I want. You want being able to post an answer, current question, and based on the current question and the answer posted, it should have some sort of score for a player or overall. Again, the specifics don't mean too much for now because we're just sort of getting things to actually work, and we can worry about the semantics later on. I want you to follow the Spring MVC architecture. So using I don't want it, because you could very easily have this all happen in the controller, but I would think it's a good place to start where we use the controller and the service, because in Spring we usually use this 3-level architecture of the controller and deals with the request, it hands it to the service does our business logic, and then we send it to a DAO or a data access object which interfaces with our database, which we haven't got set up yet, but that's coming in the future. So right now, if you could get these 2 levels set up, that would be great. I'll send you a load of resources to do with helping you understand some of this stuff, and feel free to ask me any questions. Okay, great, wicked, epic.